love saving my own tomato seeds every year. Not only is it a frugal way to garden, but it also helps you to grow plants that become really adapted to your environment and grow really well where you live. And saving tomato seeds is really easy, but there are a few things to know, and I'm going to teach you the gold standard method for saving them so that you end up with really high quality seeds. Let's start with what types of tomatoes you would even want to save seed from in the first place. Like these. These are open pollinated varieties, and that just means they're pollinated naturally by the wind, by humans, by insects. And these are the types you want to save seed from. Now, this right here is an heirloom, and an heirloom is an open pollinated variety. It just has the distinction of being passed down for generations and being over 100 years old. Of course, also great for saving. Over in this pile are hybrids, and you know it's a hybrid because it'll actually say the word hybrid, or sometimes it'll say F1. And while you technically could save seed from these types and grow a plant, the resulting tomatoes would not be anything like the parents, and so saving seeds from hybrids is generally not recommended. The next thing you want to do, and this is where it gets a little bit more advanced, but kind of fun and really sciencey, is you want to look at the flowers to determine if the specific varieties that you're growing are likely to cross-pollinate or not. In general, most tomatoes won't cross-pollinate, but there are a couple varieties and a couple types that can. And if you try to save seed from one of those, what'll happen is you'll grow a tomato that just won't be like the parent, and it won't be what you're expecting. And the way that you can tell is by looking at the flowers, specifically the reproductive parts of the flower. And this right here is a great example of a typical tomato flower. All of the reproductive parts are enclosed here. And this is what most of the flowers on your tomato plants are going to look like. These are perfect for saving seed from. Here's an example of one that could give you a little bit of trouble. These are big double blooms on a large beefsteak type tomato. And because these are so big, the center is a little bit open and the reproductive organs are slightly exposed, which means that if a bee were to come by and that bee had some other tomato pollen on it and it got into this flower, it could be cross-pollinated. Now, to learn about the ones that are likely to cross-pollinate, you're going to have to channel back to middle school biology when you learned words like stigma and style and anther and filament, because what we're looking at here is the flower's style. That's the tube that the pollen goes down, and this one is sticking up. It's sticking up just a tiny, tiny little bit there, but it's not enclosed. It'll probably help to see them closer up and side by side. So the one on the left is the one with a protruding style, and if you see that, that is a flower, that is a tomato variety that is likely to cross-pollinate because that style is just open to the world to accept pollen from any other tomato. The one on the right is totally enclosed and is safe to save seed from without giving it another thought. If you want to save seed from a tomato that's likely to cross-pollinate, you can. You just have to employ some isolation techniques, which is a different video for a different day, but you can do it. One other thing to consider is that if you are looking at all of your tomatoes and only one variety has flowers that are likely to cross-pollinate, then you don't have to worry about that either because there's no other tomato pollen around for them to cross with. Those are the high points anyways, enough to get you going without a full biology lesson, and now let's get on to the actual seed saving. As far as which actual tomatoes to save seed from, you want to pick the best of the best. Pick your best specimens. Choose the tomatoes with the most desirable characteristics. Pick the ones that ripen early and pick the ones that are the most beautiful. And if you can, it's also a good idea to pick multiple tomatoes from that variety and even from multiple plants in that variety to get the best genetic diversity. And make sure your tomatoes are ripe. It's okay to pick them underripe and let them finish ripening in the house, but just make sure when you open them up to actually collect the seeds that they are very ripe, bordering on overripe. All right, so my goal is going to be to get as many seeds out of these tomatoes as I can while making the littlest mess possible, and the way to do that is to know how to cut it. I'm going to cut it along its equator, and that's going to expose all of these beautiful seed cavities and make it really easy to squeeze the seeds out. You want to use a light hand here and a lot of finesse. We really want to just work or almost massage the seeds out from the very bottom of those seed cavities all the way to the top and up and out. So you can see here, I just keep gently squeezing it and turning it a little bit in my hands and then wiping out the seeds as I squeeze more and more. And I really trying not to get a lot of pulp along with this because then I have to strain that pulp out later and it's just easier if you don't get it in there in the first place. I think that feels pretty good, and like I got most of the seeds, you can always open it up if you want to check and make sure that you got them all. And while I'm squeezing these, let me tell you about this particular tomato because it's a very special, one-of-a-kind tomato called Fortunia. And I got the seeds from an Instagram friend who got them from an Instagram friend, and she got them from her great-grandmother. And the great-grandma got this tomato from a man who came to the United States from Sicily. This was his family heirloom tomato, probably grown for decades at least. I don't know, maybe longer than that. I wish I knew how long this went back. And his name was Fortunia. We don't know the actual name of this tomato, just that in recent years people call it Fortunia after him, and have been saving seeds from it ever since because look at this. It's a paste tomato. Look at how beefy and meaty this thing is. And of course, it has amazing flavor as well. The next step, a very important step for these seeds, is to let them ferment. So I'm going to set these just in a warm place out of direct sun. My dining room table is where I usually put them, and leave them for about 3 days until they're moldy and pretty funky. And while I've got you here, let me give you a few other techniques you can use for saving seeds, like using these little cups. I really love disposable cups because you can write on the bottom, which is handy if you are saving more than one variety of seed and you don't want to get them mixed up. I'll just write the name right on the bottom. Also, fermented tomato seeds smell really bad, so it's nice to be able to just throw the cups out when you're done. As far as getting the seeds out, you really can't go wrong with cutting along the equator like I showed last time. That works really well for these big beefsteak types and for meatier paste tomatoes like this, cutting along that equator. But for smaller paste tomatoes and cherry tomatoes, I often use a little bit different technique. Instead of cutting them in half, I like to just poke a large hole in the bottom and then give them a good squeeze. And all of the seeds and gel will come right out. It's very little mess and very easy to do. And same for cherry tomatoes too. While you could just cut them in half, I much prefer the poke and squeeze method for them, especially if you're going through a lot of them. It makes pretty quick work. One other thing I wanted to mention is that if you're only doing a small number of tomatoes, like maybe a few cherry tomatoes or something, you won't have very much seeds and gel, and that's okay, but you might have to add a little bit of water to it. If you don't have the big bulk that I had in those Fortunia seeds, they'll need a little extra juice because sitting out for 3 days, they will tend to dry out, and if they dry out, they won't ferment properly. So for an amount of seeds like this, I would probably add 1 to 2 tablespoons of water just to get them going and keep them going. And if you're finding that yours are drying out mid-fermentation, you can always add more water then too. Well, it's been 3 days. The tomato seeds are festering. They smell really horrible. And they look great. They're ready for processing. And if you're wondering why we're going to this trouble, like why can't you just squeeze the tomato seeds out and dry them? Why do you have to ferment them? The reason is that the gel, that little pocket of gel that surrounds each seed has some enzymes in it that prohibit them from sprouting, so they don't just sprout and grow new plants inside the tomato. Fermenting the seeds breaks down that gel and gives you a lot better quality seed that will last longer and will have much better germination. After giving them a good stir, I take them over to the sink because the next step is to get rid of the debris, all of that pulp, the mold, basically anything that's not seeds we want to wash away. One thing I sometimes do, and I'm doing this because these seeds are extra precious and I want to save every single one, is I use a fork to fish out the mold. And I do that because sometimes a few seeds will get trapped in the mold in kind of the stringy bits there. And so I can zhuzh them around a little bit and help dislodge the seeds before pulling that mold out. And now we can start cleaning them. The really cool thing about this and the really handy thing about this is that the seeds are heavy and they sink to the bottom and the debris is light and it floats on top so it can be poured right off. You can see there all of the little chunks of tomato falling into the sink. And as long as you go slow and you make sure to give the tomato seeds a couple seconds to sink back to the bottom after you've stirred everything up, you shouldn't lose any and they should all be collected right in the bottom of the bowl when you're done. At this point, they're looking really good, but we are going to wash them a couple more times just to get the very last little bits of tomato pulp out of there. So I'm just going to add water to this bowl, swirl it around, and repeat the process of dumping that dirty water out and letting the seeds collect at the bottom of the bowl. And one more time. It definitely doesn't have to be perfect. It's okay if there's a couple little spots of tomato pulp left in there when you're done, but you can see how much better this looks already, even after just 2 extra washes. The next step is to get these drying, and for that I like to start by putting them through a sieve, which sometimes it's a little bit hard to get them out of the bowl. They're kind of like gold, where they're heavy and they fall to the bottom. But after a few swirls of water, I have gotten all of them into the sieve. And I should mention, I'm using cold water here. I've been using cold water this whole time. You would never want to use hot water with seeds. And as long as I have them in this sieve, I'm just going to give them a quick little rinse. I can't stress enough the importance of labeling your seeds, even if you're only doing one variety the whole season, and even if you know you'll remember, you won't, I promise. You will forget. So take 5 seconds to write the name on whatever you're going to put these on to dry. I let these drip dry in the sieve for about 15 minutes, and now I'm just going to turn them out onto a paper plate. And what you dry your seeds on is really important. Paper plates are by far my favorite medium for drying seeds. Because they're paper, it helps wick away some of the moisture from the seeds, but because it's not thin or flimsy like paper towel or newspaper, it doesn't stick to the seeds really badly. I also like that they're really portable. I can move them around to different locations and I can write on them, and you can use either these like uncoated paper plates or the shinier, glossier coated ones. Either work really good. And you can see that without being too fussy about it, I spread these in a mostly thin, even layer. And now I'm going to set them out to dry. I usually put them just like on a bookshelf or on top of the fridge, somewhere out of the way. I let these sit for just 1 or 2 days before revisiting them because right now they're at a critical point. They are dry to the touch. They're not fully dry by any means, but they're dry to the touch, and they're at a stage where they're really easy to break up. These clumps that are sticking together will harden even more and become a lot harder to separate as these dry. So right now is the perfect time to go through them. And I'm also kind of scraping them off the plate. Right now they're a little bit stuck, but not too badly stuck. So I'm unsticking them and breaking them all up just kind of gently with my fingers. There's one more critical piece of information to know, and that is that these seeds are not fully dry. So if you were to put them in a plastic baggie, they would just mold. They'll need to dry at least a couple more weeks before you bag them up, and truthfully, I leave these out for quite a while. Typically, I'm so busy this time of year, I don't get around to packaging these up, usually until the end of the harvest season. I wanted to show you this book because it's one of my favorites, and I've had it for probably a decade. It's called Seed to Seed, and it walks you through how to save seeds from pretty much every single crop. And if you like the technical part, the biology part, you will love this. It goes in depth. It is the gold standard of how to save all of the seeds, and I'll link it in the video description below. I highly recommend it. The last thing, of course, is to bag them up and label them. And now you are an expert seed saver. You learned all about which varieties of tomatoes are worth saving seed from and how to tell if they've cross-pollinated. You learned how to properly ferment the tomato seeds so that they have good germination, and also how to dry them. And if you found this video helpful, I would love it if you could give it a thumbs up and make sure to subscribe to my channel so that you are the first to know whenever a new video is posted.